I want to welcome you very warmly in our conference. So we are extremely happy that you accepted our invitation. My name is Tomaszewski. I'm senior analyst at Polityka Insight, and here is Dominik Brodacki, my colleague. We both cover energy and issues and climate policy in Poland and in the European Union in Polityka Insight. And the first question to you, I would like to ask you about your attitude to this, what is going to happen in 2021, because 2020 was extremely hard for our economy, for our for whole European Union, for all the member states, of course, because of the pandemic. But if we talk about climate policy, there are signs to be more optimistic about what is going to happen. We have in USA, which is coming back to the Paris Climate Agreement. We have China, which is going to publish detailed plan how to achieve the climate neutrality in April. And we have, of course, European Union with a very ambitious climate agenda. So my question to you is dawn of climate optimism breaking? And do you think that we will use this opportunity to slow down the pace of global warming globally? Please, sir.
Well, I think in the first place, if you compare where we are now with a year ago, there's reason to be more optimistic. The European Union launched its Green Deal over a year ago, and then we were sort of alone, and many people were saying we're only 8 or 9% of emissions worldwide. There's no point if the rest doesn't do anything. And since then, you've seen China, Japan announcing climate neutrality 2050, South Korea, South Africa, and a host of countries moving in that direction. Of course, after the elections in the United States, you also have the Biden administration on board, even quite radically on board, I would say, with really a change of course. And I believe that bodes well for the political side. But one has to also be realistic on the content side, on what's happening with our climate. We're still on a bad track. We still are not on the right track. So we get this opportunity because of the political constellation to try and get it right when the world meets in Glasgow in November this year, to then set the course to climate neutrality. And we've done our homework. We will also decide on the climate law in spring, and then we will come with concrete proposals. And let's hope we can convince the rest of the world to go in the same direction. Then we can be optimistic.
But what risk do you see in this process? Because everybody can agree to this, that this climate race is accelerating. But do you think that what are the main obstacles that you can see in this coming year, in 2021, that we need to be aware of?
Well, frankly, I think the main obstacle is political. Because most of business, look at your own country, business in Poland has turned a corner. Business in Poland understands we need to go into this direction, but we need to organize this. This is a very, very complex transition, and a complex transition that happens on a world scale. So we need to get organized to make it happen. And of course, there will be, because every transition is painful and difficult. And sometimes the temptation is to just look at the mountain you need to climb and then to say, the mountain is too high, I'll avoid climbing it. But then we have to look at the cost of non-transiting, and that cost is even much higher. So I think the main bottleneck is, do we have enough political will and political courage to do what is necessary? I think the omens are positive. But there can always be, the pandemic is still not under control. The consequence for the economy, we cannot all oversee right now. But given the determination of the leaders, I think we can get there this year.
Okay, so according to this political will, is the climate diplomacy a possible political bridge in new relationships between EU and USA, and a measure to rebuild them? How to build and develop it?
I think so. I think it is very important. This is one issue that's so fascinating. Sometimes you have issues of foreign policy and you have issues of domestic policy. Well, this is one issue that is at the same time profoundly foreign political and internal political, because the only way you can convince other international partners to go into the same direction is if you can present them with your plans, which are about internal transformation. So that's why when I've had a number of conversations now with John Kerry, the American climate envoy. That's why our conversation are very often about, so what are you going to do in the energy sector? What are you going to do in housing? What's happening with the car industry? What are you going to do in agriculture? Very, very concretely, what you do at home has an impact on your credibility when you go to an international conference. And there the Americans seem to have quite a serious agenda. Also, if you look at the first moves of President Biden. So combining our efforts, including the fact that, and I spoke to a Chinese deputy prime minister earlier today, including the fact that China also wants to be seen as one of the leaders. I mean, this creates momentum. And also when I talk to the vice premier of China, it is about the internal measures we talk about. When are you going to peak out your carbon emissions? What are you going to do with coal-fired power generation? What are you going to do with your emissions trading system? These are very concrete things where internal politics and foreign policy are completely intertwined.
And making our scope of thinking a little bit broader, do you think that Europe may keep its position as a climate champion globally? Because we see this like we see what's happening in the United States, we see what's happening in China, in developed economies of Asia, and so on. So do you think that in the perspective of the next decade, Europe will keep its position of the global climate champion?
If we want it, yes. It's all in our own hands. If we stay united as Europeans, if we stay the course, we maintain the course of the climate law, we maintain the course on minus 55 in 10 years' time in terms of emissions, we maintain the course on climate neutrality in 2050, we do the right policies to get us there, then we will retain the leadership. But even if we were not to retain the leadership, this is a race to the top. I mean, if somebody else beats us, the Americans or others beat us, great, because the planet will improve. But I don't think they will beat us. I think we will retain this leadership because we have a number of steps, gone a number of steps further than they have so far, but they can overtake us. The only thing that can slow us down is division. If we can't agree to move forward. So it's in our own hands. And again, it's about politics.
And about these divisions, I wanted to ask you in this question. EU is divided in the shape and pace of the transformation. The division is between the member states. It is, of course, based on that Eastern countries are basing their energy systems more on fossil fuels. Western countries are more targeting renewables, nuclear energy, and so on to move in that direction. Do you think that those divisions inside the EU are our weakness or our strength that we can somehow use to increase this pace of transformation? How do you see this situation? And do you see if these divisions are getting bigger, or are we moving and trying to build bridges in this energy transformation?
Well, to start with your last question, the divisions are getting smaller, and they're quickly getting smaller. We're all getting on the same page. Secondly, we all have different starting positions. You have a different geographical position. When you're close to the sea, it's easier to generate offshore wind. If you're landlocked, that's much more difficult, obviously. We have different histories. Some countries in Central and Eastern Europe carry on their shoulders a huge legacy of oppression and occupation that also had a huge influence on the energy mix, because, as you know, the Soviet system was maintained through energy more than anything else. But it's no longer an East-West divide so much, because some countries in the West have taken steps to reduce their dependency on fossil fuels. Take France, for example, where much of the energy generation is nuclear. But some countries in Western Europe, like Germany, still have coal mines. Some countries in Central and Eastern Europe have gone quite far. Hungary is moving quite quickly, and the Baltic states are moving very quickly. So I would never see this as an East-West issue. I would more see it as every single member state has its own challenges, and Poland has a particular challenge with an 80% dependency on coal for energy generation. Then the final point of it, is it a strength or a weakness? It is a strength if we are able to concretely show solidarity, if we can show concretely that those member states with an extra challenge also get extra support from the others who have less of a challenge. So if we leave no one behind, if we show clearly a strategy to get everybody at the same level, even if some have more work to do, then I believe this can be a strength, the division, because then countries can specialize. I can come up with a number of ideas where Poland, for instance, could specialize. Poland could be a prime place for the generation of hydrogen, for instance. Just to give you one example, Poland has huge opportunities in the Baltic Sea for offshore wind. Nobody was talking about that 5 years ago. Now look what's happening. If you look at in Poland, how many people are picking up the possibilities of solar energy, also on a private level. It's incredible. It's almost a revolution. So, you know, I am very enthusiastic about these possibilities, and there's no country that has to fear to be left behind here. Not just because, you know, there's a clear expression of solidarity in our policies, but also because the populations want it. You know, again, take Poland as an example. I think most Poles, especially younger people, your generation, find it completely unacceptable that more than 30,000 people every year die prematurely because of bad air quality. That's about 10 times the people Poland loses through car accidents. I mean, this is not acceptable, and I don't think any citizen in Poland wants their children to live in those conditions.
These divisions which we're talking about, we can easily see in a rising electricity prices in Europe, and how not to deepen social inequalities and create new areas of exclusion, and how to rebuild the social policy to complement the energy policy.
Yes, and I think you raise a very, very important issue. If this transformation leads to especially the people who are already in a weaker position, getting even weaker, and those people already in a good position getting even richer, then it will be socially so divisive that it will not happen. And everybody who's very enthusiastic about the transition should understand this. It is going to be a just transition, or there's just not going to be a transition. It's that simple. And energy poverty is one of the key issues in this, and especially with countries who have a very, very long legacy dating before their freedom, before the fall of the Berlin Wall, when there was still an Iron Curtain. Energy was one of the prime instruments to make the system work, and then the subsidies on energies were out of this world. Energy was almost without cost, and that is one of the reasons why in some countries there's such incredible pollution because of this, because there was no price on it. But now when a price is going to be put on it, we need to make sure through different means that this is a fair price. First of all, look at housing. Most energy bills of people are linked with their need to heat or cool, but especially heat their housing. If we have, through programs such as the renovation wave, if we have the possibility to insulate buildings, to change the heat structure, to move away from coal and move into natural gas as a transitional energy source, to create the most modern ways of generating heat, whether it's heat pumps or with the help of solar panels or other. If we can have these big programs in many, many Polish cities and in the countryside, then you will keep the energy bill down. But also we will have to look at taxation issues. How do you put tax on energy, and who pays the tax for energy? I mean, it has to be a policy mix that assures the fact that energy poverty will not happen. Again, fundamentally, it's a political issue, not a technical one.
It's the case when we talk about energy poverty. It is, of course, especially in Poland, the thing that the growing prices of CO2 makes the electricity more expensive, and the danger of creation of the energy poverty is approaching. But during this transition period of our economy, of our energy system, for example, in Polish heating systems, we will need more gas. And just to replace coal, just to make all the system work, do you see that the risk that on the one hand, we as a European Union, we approve this way, that the gas will be used during this transition period of our transformation. But on the other hand, the growing prices of CO2 can jump to such a level that even gas starts to be a very problematic fuel from economic point of view for the companies which are producing heat. So how to balance this? Because the transformation is like the accelerating every year, and we can see this in Poland especially. But the risks every year are also bigger. So do you see a balance here that we can have some artificial brakes that we can push if we see that the prices, for example, for electricity or heat are too high?
Well, let me put it this way. I think already, both in terms of price and in terms of emissions, natural gas is a huge improvement over coal. Because if you look at coal, you don't only look at the price paid by the consumer. You have to look at the subsidies given to keep that sector alive, which in the Polish case is enormous. There is no future in coal. Let's start from that. And I think I had a meeting with the trade unions from all over Europe, but especially Central and Eastern Europe last week. And there's not one trade union that disputes this. There is no future in coal. The only question is, how do you exit from it in a fair way? So natural gas will have to be a transition fuel. If you do the investments you need for that in power generation, in the infrastructure to get it to the households, if you do that in such a way that you pre-fit this infrastructure for post-natural gas energy carriers, which can be decarbonated natural gas, but especially hydrogen or other such fuels, such energy carriers, then it's a really good investment, because then the investment is really very limited. And the results will be huge, because then once you can use decarbonated or carbon-free energy carriers, then of course the cost will go down tremendously. And especially if you see the latest developments surrounding hydrogen and the possibilities. Now I saw a project, just to give you a concrete example. Siemens is now making a project where the electrolyzer is directly incorporated in the huge turbines that they put on sea. So you will then, through wind energy, get direct hydrogen delivered to your shores, and that hydrogen you can treat exactly the same way as we will treat natural gas today. And also the cost per household will be limited, because the adaptation of the infrastructure in every house is limited. It's about 25% of the cost of completely new infrastructure for new energy carrier. So I would see it in that context, and then I believe the cost will be bearable and the cost will go down.
So now I have more philosophical question to you about how energy transformation can shape and transform our democracy. Because as you mentioned before, for example in Poland, but also in other countries in Europe, we observe a growing number of prosumers, people who are producing their own electricity using the rooftop photovoltaic panels and so on. On the other hand, as we mentioned during our conversation, there is a risk of this energy poverty, for example, which will the scope of it will be broader, and it can, for example, fuel some populism. Politicians who will show that, look, we cannot go this direction. It makes our bills for electricity, for energy higher. We have to stop. Like bad people in Brussels are dictating us what to do with our coal, with gas, and so on. So. How this process of transformation and the growing also awareness of this, that I can produce my electricity, I am aware that the climate is changing, how it will change our political system and democracy?
I think that is a very, very profound question, especially at a time when, what we always thought was without discussion, democracy, the rule of law, free media, and all of that is now being challenged again. And why is it being challenged? I think essentially because many people in our societies are very, very worried about the future, and they become pessimistic, and then they become tempted by politicians who promise them a return to the past. They create a mythical image of a past that never was, and then they promise that they will take people back there. And of course they can't deliver on that. And when they can't deliver, they start looking for scapegoats. And it's always the foreigner or the people with a different religion, or etc., or the homosexual. There's always somebody to blame, and I think this is the biggest threat in our society, and it's not new. It's not new. If you study history, in any period of profound societal transformation, the risk is there that this happens. Because it's not just the energy transition we're going through. It's not just the climate crisis. It's not just this horrible biodiversity crisis. We're also in the middle of an industrial revolution that is more profound than anything humanity has seen before, because it's happening everywhere in the world. And it's even challenging the most fundamental concepts of humanity. Artificial intelligence we always linked to human beings. Now we see machines developing their own intelligence. Just imagine how profoundly this affects our self-image as human beings and challenges our values. So we need to make sure that we convince society that this is in society's interest, and we also need to debunk some of the stories that are being told. And the one example I used last week, which is very clear, how we should operate in this. You remember when President Trump was elected, he promised he would increase coal production. Now, after 4 years, in his 4 years term, coal production reduced faster than any time before in American history, simply because the external factors were there. The economy was dictating this. The industry had already turned the page, etc. Now, in a highly charged ideological environment, people don't want to hear this. But if we can get into a rational discussion about things like that, then people will see this. And fundamental for Europe, I believe, and especially for Poland, is to compare the cost of transition with the cost of doing nothing. And then I think both in terms of human lives, in terms of economic opportunity, but also in terms of simply the cost of energy, Poland would hurt itself tremendously if it did not embrace the potential of the energy transition. I'm deeply convinced of that.
I just want to grill you a little bit more on this issue, because you mentioned a very interesting case of Trump and coal. And he was the most president of the United States, is the most powerful man in the world. And even Trump couldn't stop this process. He couldn't just make coal great again and just change the direction of our transformation, leaving fossil fuels to renewables. Do you see a risk in this? Because we can, of course, be happy that United States are coming back on a path to the Paris agreements. But on the other hand, this case shows us that, like, democratic leader elected in a fair election couldn't use his power to change that. Like, this process of transformation is undemocratic. I mean, in a way that the member states cannot, for example, in European Union, cannot control it in the same way they could before. So we see advantages of this, of course, because we are fighting global warming, and this is good. But don't you see a risk that without this control, we are just in very delicate situation?
Well, I wonder how we should approach this. Who is to blame here? Is this because others are making this transition happen, or is it because politicians are making completely unrealistic and impossible proposals? I think if you look back at those years, we now have people in the American Congress who are saying that there is the wildfires in California are created by a Jewish laser beam from space. I mean, no, seriously, if you go down that rabbit hole of just creating myths, and fortunately, we have very, very few people in Europe doing that. And fortunately, with all the political divisions there are, and you know that you know my past, I have not always seen eye to eye with this Polish government. There's no need to hide that. But also, this Polish government has made it very clear that they want a strategy to exit out of coal. Who would have thought that 5 years ago or 10 years ago, when still, you know, everybody was saying coal is forever? So, you know, I am in Europe. I'm slightly more optimistic than that. We will not overdo the promises to people that we can never keep, and there is more dialogue and there is more back and forth here. The two things I fear most in Europe, to be honest with you, and I think these two things do play a role also in the Polish debate. The two things I fear most is an increasing chasm, an increasing gap between people with higher education and people with lower education. That I think is a real strain on our society if we don't solve it, especially if the Industrial Revolution would exacerbate that. And the second one is the potential chasm between urban areas and rural areas, between the major cities and the more rural areas. And that's where I believe the transition should focus on, to make sure that we leave no one behind, and that we sort of never leave behind the people with lower education, and we never leave behind the rural areas. And that's the only way we can come out of this in a positive way. If we neglect those challenges, then you give room to the populists.
I have just last philosophical question to you, sir, and it is also, of course, about the energy transformation. But do you think it can be fully peaceful? Because now we are, of course, concentrated on the pace of the transformation, on the prices of the electricity. But if we look on the world map and think about coming decades, we will see, obviously, that the role of fossil fuels in global economy will decrease. Countries like Russia, Saudi Arabia, African countries, which are exporting a lot of fossil fuels, raw materials, and so on, will be losing their, in case of Russia, their geopolitical weapon, for example, to threaten their neighbors. What will be the geopolitical impact of transformation on us, on Europe, but also in the bigger scale on our neighbors? How it will transform it?
Well, let me repeat what I said earlier. Every industrial revolution, especially if it also concerns energy, has the potential to be incredibly disruptive on a national scale, on a continental scale, and on a global scale. Some are preparing for this. If you look at the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, etc., they are investing massively in a future based on hydrogen. You see the same in the north of Africa. You see the same in the United States. Is a huge energy producer. They're thinking about the same potential. So some are really already preparing for this. Russia is only very, very carefully exploring this. And you know, as someone who's worked and lived in Russia, and this is, you know, this is my background. I think we should be thinking about that as Europeans, also because a Russia that is unstable or desperate is a direct challenge, if not threat, to our own stability. So we should be thinking in long-term geopolitical frameworks about this relationship and how we could also be a part of helping Russia digest this energy transition, and then investments will be necessary in completely new areas and make them less dependent of raw material production. Also because if you move into new areas, you also have a chance of more developing the middle classes, and that will create better circumstances for the rule of law, for an open society, and for democracy. But Russia is a long way from that. But you see people going to the streets. Why? Because they're unhappy with the situation as is. But having said all that, just imagine what the potential for conflict would be if we do not come to terms with the climate crisis. Then we will have wars over water. That is my prediction if we don't change our policies, because water is going to be scarce. Droughts are going to be everywhere. You will not be able to have crops in places where for millennia you had crops. The weather will become completely erratic. We will have storms that we cannot predict and cannot control. And then we're just talking about Europe. Just imagine what this will do to Africa and other places. There is another factor here that I want to draw your attention to. You were talking about the energy factor. We were also talking about the Industrial Revolution. Look at the demographic factor. We are now about 500 million Europeans. We will probably be more or less 500 million in the future, perhaps a bit less. Africa is going from less than 1 billion to 2, 3, 4 perhaps billion in the future. Just imagine, just comparing these two continents, what these demographic changes mean of how we need to realign ourselves and how we need to reinvent ourselves in terms of our economy and in terms of our energy. So I'm sorry that if I expanded a bit too much, but I think your question raises very, very fundamental issues that we need to address as societies. And I hope more people like yourselves would pay attention to this, because this is much, much more than just an energy transition.
So going back to this social aspect of climate policy, I'd like to ask you about that race to become a climate leader around the world. Do you think that this race could turn into something like a Cold War that we know from the period before 1989? I mean, the situation where we will lose control over the social aspect of climate policy.
I am not too worried about that. I'm more worried about the risk of this going so fast that you will have a too small group of big winners and a big group of losers, not just in Europe, but especially if I look at the developing world. And I think if we look at the COVID crisis, this is sort of a foreboding of what could happen if you do not take into account the challenges and the needs of lesser developed countries. I think, what we will see happening in the next months and years with the vaccines, in terms of if we are able to also help those who cannot help themselves initially, if we show leadership there as Europeans, then I think we can sort of convince others to follow our way. But if we leave that open only to the Chinese and the Russians, we will create unnecessary friction with some parts of the world that are essential for our own future. And I want to mention Africa again, but also our neighbors, our immediate neighbors to the east and to the southeast, Ukraine and the countries in the Western Balkans. There's a great game going on. All sorts of people are trying to exert their influence there. Not just the Russians, also from Turkey and others. And I think the European Union has to assure that those countries still keep a European perspective. And to do that, we need to help them through this very difficult period and not be selfish.
And how to do that? How to show those countries that EU perspective is proper way?
Well, why don't we start with energy? Why don't we look at the energy generation, for instance, in the Western Balkans, which is very often based on coal and very often with power stations that are very much outdated, very polluting. Why don't we try and get them as closely affiliated with our energy union as we can and help them build clean energy generation, help them be part of the wider grid, help them embrace this future with solar energy generation, thermal energy generation. I think also biomethane in agriculture can be a huge. All these things we want for ourselves. I think with a sense of urgency, we should also be discussing with the countries in the Western Balkans and to the east of us, Ukraine first and foremost.
And sir, the last question from us today to you is a very short one. Poland is still the only country in Europe which still has not recognized the goal of achieving climate neutrality till 2050 yet. Do you think that Warsaw will change its mind this year?
Well, I think there is a high level of what I would call a constructive ambiguity here on all sides. But my bottom line is still that Poland is on board. Only Poland wants to know exactly what this means concretely for Poland. 6 coal mining regions still having to exit out of coal. They're not all in the same situation. How long will this take? There is an agreement between the government and the trade unions, but it still needs to be submitted to Brussels and see what happens. And then you have some amazing coal mining regions. IKEA Polska declaring that it wants to be climate neutral very soon. I mean, this is just so exciting to me. So I believe that the pulse of Polish society is beating hard for this transformation, and I believe that the government knows this. And I also believe, if you put all the European money together that will be available for Poland, we are talking to almost 1/4 of Polish GDP. Can you imagine how big that investment is? And can you imagine how huge the opportunity is for Poland? Or to put it in a reverse reasoning, what a huge missed opportunity it would be if Poland did not embrace this transformation, being helped by its friends and partners in such a huge way. Up to 1/4 of Polish GDP coming from other European countries to support Poland in its transformation. That's quite something. And I hope it also underlines the fact that everybody recognizes that Poland is crucial in this transformation, but also that there is something like EU solidarity, and that there is something like Brussels listening to the aspirations and wishes of Poland.
So thank you. I'm sorry for torturing you a little bit longer, but it was extremely interesting conversation. Thank you very much. We really appreciate that you joined us, and hopefully we'll meet again soon, maybe on the next Risk and Trends of Polityka Insight next year. We really appreciate what you said. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Dziękujemy.
Cześć.
See you soon.